August 1945. The tropical air of Sumatra hung heavy with heat and silence. Beyond the rusted gates of the former Japanese internment camp, a convoy of British trucks arrived. Khaki uniforms gleaming, white armbands marked Allied repatriation mission. Inside the camp, hundreds of Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and wives of officers waited, their faces pale beneath the sun. They had been held under watch since Japan's surrender only weeks earlier, uncertain of their fate. For years, they had lived under the strict order of the imperial system. Women ate separately, spoke softly, and never looked a man in the eye without permission. But that day, as they were escorted into a makeshift canteen for their first meal under Allied supervision, their world shattered. At long wooden tables, British and Dutch soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder with women, laughing, sharing bowls, passing bread. Men and women eating together, talking as equals. For the Japanese women prisoners, it was not merely a meal. It was the first glimpse of a different world. Their shock was profound, and history was about to turn its page. To understand that moment of disbelief, we must step back to the empire that shaped those women. For decades, Japan's society had been built upon rigid hierarchies. The emperor at the top, followed by the military, then men, and finally women. It was a culture steeped in obedience, restraint, and collective honor. A woman's virtue was measured by her silence, her loyalty, and her ability to serve. First her father, then her husband, and above all, the nation. By the time the Second World War consumed Asia, these expectations had hardened into state ideology. From 1937 onward, when Japan's war in China intensified, the government mobilized not only soldiers, but also women, nurses, clerical aides, and volunteer corps sent to support the military machine. Many of them were dispatched to territories across Southeast Asia, Burma, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. In these far-flung outposts, Japanese women lived under strict military discipline. Meals were segregated, ranks enforced even in daily routines. Women served officers but never dined with them. To sit beside a man during a meal, let alone share food, was unthinkable. But when Japan's empire began to crumble in 1944, and Allied forces advanced island by island, the boundaries of that controlled world began to collapse. By mid-1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet entry into the war, surrender was inevitable. Across Asia, tens of thousands of Japanese troops, and the women attached to them, found themselves cut off, isolated, and captured. In former Dutch colonies like Sumatra, Java, and Borneo, Japanese women who had once served the imperial cause suddenly became prisoners of the very people they had been taught to despise. And soon, they would come face to face with a civilization utterly unlike their own. In the months following Japan's surrender, the Dutch East Indies became a chaotic crossroads of victors, survivors, and the defeated. British and Australian forces under the Southeast Asia Command were tasked with disarming Japanese troops, repatriating prisoners of war, and restoring order to territories ravaged by occupation. In camps across Java and Sumatra, thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians were gathered for processing. Among them were hundreds of women, military nurses, clerks, teachers, and wives of officers. Many had followed their husbands into the tropics at the height of the empire's expansion. Now, they waited in bamboo barracks under Allied watch, stripped of rank, power, and certainty. The irony was not lost on the Allied officers who entered those camps. Only months earlier, Allied women, British, Dutch, Australian, had been prisoners under Japanese rule in these same islands. Many had suffered starvation, disease, and humiliation in internment camps like Bandung, Palembang, and Batavia. Now, the roles were reversed. For the Japanese, captivity was more than a military defeat. It was a collapse of worldview. Their emperor, once considered divine, had spoken on the radio to surrender. The Bushido Code of Honor had no place in this new order. To be captured was shame enough. To be treated humanely by the enemy was beyond comprehension. When Allied officers established communal dining halls to serve both male and female detainees, they did so out of practicality. Limited supplies, limited space. But for the Japanese women, it was something else entirely. A cultural earthquake. They had been raised in a society where gender boundaries were sacred and male authority absolute. And now, in a humid Allied canteen, they witnessed men and women laughing freely together, a sight that defied everything they had been taught to believe. This clash of worlds would reveal not only the scars of war, but the profound cultural distance between conqueror and conquered. The first angle to understand this moment is cultural, the collision between Japan's pre-war social code and the liberal customs of the Western Allies. In Imperial Japan, a woman's presence was governed by on, duty, and giri, obligation. Even within the military auxiliary corps, female nurses and clerks were expected to uphold modesty, deference, and subservience. They lived in quarters apart from men, addressed them with formal speech, and never shared social spaces as equals. Dining, in particular, reflected hierarchy. Officers first, then enlisted men, then women. Eating was not communal. It was structured ritual. When Allied canteens were established after surrender, they operated under entirely different principles. British and Dutch officers had grown accustomed to mixed dining during the war. Women in Allied service, nurses, secretaries, drivers, worked and ate alongside men. Gender equality was not complete, but it existed in visible, everyday gestures. A soldier holding a door for a nurse. A sergeant chatting casually with a female medic over tea. For the Japanese women now seated in those makeshift mess halls, it was an encounter with an alien form of humanity. They stared, some whispering in disbelief, others lowering their eyes, afraid to even look at the men laughing nearby. To them, such informality between the sexes bordered on indecency. Yet for Allied personnel, it was simply ordinary life. They didn't realize their behavior was being observed as something revolutionary. The second angle is human, the quiet emotional unraveling that accompanied defeat. Many of these women had been trained to believe that Allied forces were brutal, that surrender meant dishonor or death. But the guards who now distributed their rations spoke politely, even kindly. They treated the women with a respect that confused them more than cruelty ever. Could some Japanese nurses later recalled in post-war interviews that they could not understand the Westerners' way of living. To them, seeing a female Allied officer joking with a male soldier while eating the same food represented a kind of freedom, but also shame, because in that laughter and equality, they saw the world Japan had promised to reject, and the one that had ultimately defeated them. The third angle is political. The transformation of power at the moment of surrender. For nearly a decade, the Japanese Empire had ruled Southeast Asia with iron discipline, enforcing its own racial and cultural hierarchy. Japanese men stood at the top, followed by their female auxiliaries, and beneath them, the conquered peoples. Malays, Indonesians, Chinese, and Western colonials. But in defeat, that pyramid inverted overnight. Allied officers now commanded, and Japanese detainees were forced to obey. Yet unlike the harsh methods once used by imperial authorities, the Allies approached with bureaucratic efficiency and a surprising degree of restraint. To Western officers, allowing men and women to eat together was no act of rebellion. It was simple organization. To the Japanese, it looked like chaos, a world turned upside down. Authority and gender blurred, the very foundations of discipline. The separation of male and female, officer and subordinate, seemed to dissolve in front of their eyes. The fourth angle is moral, the slow awakening of empathy amid humiliation. Many Allied observers, themselves hardened by years of war, noticed the bewilderment of the Japanese women. Some had been nurses who tended to dying soldiers. Others were widows, their husbands buried somewhere in the jungles of Burma or the beaches of the Philippines. Now, stripped of uniforms and titles, they stood in line for food alongside the men they once served. For the first time, they experienced what it meant to be treated as individuals rather than instruments of duty. One British nurse stationed at a repatriation camp in Palembang wrote, "They bowed deeply, still clinging to formality. But when they saw us sharing the same bread with our men, something in their faces changed. I think they began to understand that not every victor seeks vengeance." War had forced these women into roles they never chose. And peace would expose them to freedoms they had never imagined. What began as a simple meal became an unexpected lesson in equality, compassion, and the quiet dignity of survival. In that mess hall, as the clatter of tin plates echoed beneath the fans, two worlds, one built on obedience, the other on liberty, faced each other across a table. It happened on a sweltering afternoon in late August 1945, inside the repatriation camp at Palembang, Sumatra. Allied guards had prepared the day's rations: canned meat, rice, bread, and weak tea. The Japanese prisoners, men and women alike, were assembled under a corrugated metal roof that served as the communal dining area. A British officer, Captain Harold Miles of the 26th Indian Division, stood at the entrance with a clipboard calling names for rations. He expected compliance. What he didn't expect was hesitation. The women froze. Many refused to sit when told to take their places beside men. Some stood silently clutching their bowls, waiting for orders that never came. They were accustomed to strict separation, to bowing before male superiors, to eating only after the men had finished. Here, no such command existed. Miles, unaware of the cultural barrier, grew impatient. "Sit wherever you like," he said curtly. But that phrase, "wherever you like," struck deeper than he could have imagined. In Japanese culture, such freedom was not liberation. It was disorientation. Without hierarchy, without order, there was shame. Yet one young nurse, perhaps no older than 22, broke the silence. Trembling, she sat at the far end of the table beside a Dutch female clerk and a British sergeant. The others watched. Then, slowly, they followed. The sound of chairs scraping the floor was almost ceremonial. Bowls were placed, hands folded, and the first bites taken in uneasy quiet. Then something extraordinary happened. Conversation. The British sergeant offered bread to the nurse beside him. She hesitated, then accepted. Laughter followed. Light, uncertain, human. In that instant, the invisible wall that had defined their lives began to crack. For the first time, defeated soldiers and conquered women sat as equals, not by command, but by circumstance. The war that had divided East and West was ending, not in violence, but in a shared meal under a tin roof. It was a small gesture, but one history would remember as the moment Japan's rigid empire began to meet the modern world. As days passed, that fragile ritual, men and women eating together, became part of daily camp life. What began as a shock slowly turned into reluctant acceptance, then quiet understanding. At first, the Japanese women clung to formality. They bowed before receiving food, apologized when addressed directly, and kept their eyes lowered. But over time, the constant presence of Allied nurses and officers, laughing freely with their male counterparts, began to soften their reserve. For many, the realization came not through words, but through observation. They saw men clearing plates, offering water, or helping female clerks lift heavy crates, actions unthinkable under Japan's wartime codes. In their homeland, such gestures would have been seen as weakness. Here, they were seen as respect. One Allied interpreter, a Nisei, Japanese-American sergeant named Kenji Sato later recalled, "They looked at me like I belonged to two worlds. I could speak their language, but I had learned the Western way. When I told them that men and women worked together as equals, some wept. They said they had never imagined such a thing." To the Japanese guards turned prisoners, the same sight carried humiliation. Their authority was gone, their empire erased. But to the women, especially those who had served as nurses or clerks, the experience planted something quietly subversive: curiosity. Every meal became a lesson in another civilization. The laughter, the casualness, the way Allied men treated women not as subordinates, but as comrades. It was unsettling, yet magnetic. When orders came weeks later to prepare for repatriation, many women carried away not just their meager belongings, but a memory that would linger long after the voyage home. The image of men and women sharing food without fear or shame. For those who had known only hierarchy, that memory was both painful and liberating. The moment they realized the world beyond Japan's islands was larger, freer, and far more complex than they had ever been told. The war had ended. But in those small human moments, a new world, one built on equality rather than empire, was quietly being born. When the transports finally arrived at the port of Singapore and Batavia, the Japanese prisoners were divided into groups for repatriation. Men and women boarded separate vessels, but the lessons of their captivity traveled with them. In Tokyo, Yokohama, and Kobe, the returning women faced a country unrecognizable from the one they had left. Cities lay in ruins, industries silent, and the once mighty Imperial Army dissolved. The emperor, no longer divine, now spoke to his people as a man, and in that fragile silence of defeat, Japan began its slow reconstruction, not just of buildings, but of its soul. Many of the former nurses and clerks found themselves drawn into the great transformation that followed. Under the post-war Allied occupation, new laws granted women rights they had never imagined: suffrage, education, and the ability to work outside the household. To some, these reforms echoed what they had seen in those humid mess halls far from home. Men and women sharing tables, voices, and dignity. One repatriated nurse, interviewed years later, said quietly, "I thought freedom was something Western, not Japanese. But when I came home, I realized it could belong to anyone brave enough to see others as equals." The war had destroyed empires, but it had also exposed the illusions that sustained them. The Japanese women who once trembled at the thought of eating beside men had glimpsed a simple truth: that power and respect did not need to come from rank or gender, but from humanity itself. Their shock had not been born of rebellion, but of recognition. In that Allied canteen, they saw the beginnings of a world where duty no longer required silence, and where a woman could raise her head without shame. History often records great wars through battles, strategies, and leaders. Yet, sometimes, the real turning points are smaller. A shared loaf of bread, a hesitant smile across a table. Those brief encounters in the aftermath of surrender became quiet symbols of Japan's awakening. They marked the end of an empire, yes, but also the birth of a generation that would rebuild the nation on new ideals: equality, democracy, and peace. And so, the story of the Japanese women prisoners, their shock, their confusion, their awakening, remains more than a footnote in the chronicles of war. It stands as a reminder that even in the ruins of defeat, humanity can rediscover itself, not through conquest, but through the simplest act of all: sharing a meal.